What's up, YouTube? It's your boy JPZ on the keys, and it's too easy about the video today. And I'm just looking, and apparently the video I did, the Thomas Sowell video, a good amount of people have watched the video. So I appreciate the people who have come from that video. And this other video was recommended a lot, so I figured to myself, why not watch it? You know what I mean? So I want to clarify a couple things. Just like really one basic thing. Like a lot of people were saying in the comments that, oh, how am I so naive for not knowing that Roots wasn't real? Like, obviously, I know it was a historical depiction. It's just when I heard that the creator said that he wanted to make it a myth, that was what caught me. Because I obviously didn't know that, because when I see Roots, I think Roots is a pretty good depiction of what slavery was in America back in that time, and then to hear that was like kind of a culture shock. But this is The British Crusade to End Slavery. This is by Sargon of Akkad. I've heard of his channel before. I haven't really watched any of his videos, but because that just wasn't really my interest. But I'm going to go in this with an open mind. I'm just going to listen, receive this information. I'm going to make comments where I feel like I should. But let's just sit here and really see if we can gather something from this.
Stupid attitudes to race and immigration are beyond parody, by Frankie Boyle. For those who aren't aware, Frankie Boyle is a famous Scottish comedian who is most renowned for being pretty damn offensive. Needless to say, I'm a fan of his. And so when Frankie Boyle writes an article for The Guardian of all places, with the subtitle, "The Anti-Immigration Election Rhetoric is Perverse. We fear the arrival of people we have drawn here with the wealth we stole from them," I can see the misinformation coming a mile away. So Frankie begins the article by waffling in an overly verbose manner, reminiscent of Charlie Brooker, another man who I am a fan of, but has been led astray by misinformation. And it's full of these sort of contradictions that I'm sure sounded good when he was writing them, but when you actually think about it, are rather silly. I mean, here he is pointing out the irony of the leaders being nationalist and warning about the Scottish National Party, after making a crack about how the Scottish discovered penicillin, and taking credit for this for some reason. And for some reason he seems to mix up the concepts of trade and immigration. But these really aren't very important. I'm not even bothered that he just assumes that an Australian-style point system for immigration will obviously be a racist system that caters exclusively to white people. This is despite the fact that a Cambridge economics professor has warned the sheer scale of immigration has caused problems for the UK's infrastructure, which was largely built in the 70s. But you know what? None of that really bothers me. What really bothers me is Frankie Boyle's attempt to make British people feel ashamed of Britain's involvement in the slave trade. That really gets my goat, because Britain's involvement in the slave trade is one of the most proud accomplishments of British history. And I know what you're thinking, oh my goodness, slavery is bad. And that's correct.
Of course.
Which is why the British ended it. For everyone. If we just take a cursory look at the subject, you can see how it is not nearly as cut and dried as Frankie makes it out to be. Even the very word slave comes from Slav, because of the sheer number of...
Yeah, I was thinking to myself, like Slavic people, that sounds like a European people. So it originated I understand why people in America focus so much on the American version of slavery, but the fact that slavery has always been going on. Even before 1865, even before 1612, Jamestown, all these other sites, whatever.
Of Slavs taken as slaves by conquering peoples. But Frankie is trying to drum up white guilt. So let's talk about African slavery. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to start exploring the West African coast, And they did indeed capture African natives to be brought back to Portugal as items of curiosity. Europeans who travelled to Western Africa discovered that Western Africa had civilizations of its own. For example, a Dutch visitor to Benin City wrote in around 1600, "As you enter it, the town appears very great. You go into a great broad street, not paved, which seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmost street in Amsterdam. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close and even with the other, as the houses in Holland stand." More than a century earlier, Benin exchanged ambassadors with Portugal. The Portuguese did take a few Africans back to Europe, but they didn't need to set up operations because they discovered that there were already thriving slave trades in Africa.
See, and this is what, like, people don't, not just they don't, they don't want to hear it. Now also because, like, it's 2 reasons. Also because it's like, they just don't want to believe that it happened, and they don't also want to believe that Africans were enslaved. Like, slavery is a worldwide practice. Every civilization enslaved people. That's what I was trying to say in the last video. Like, you have to think, why would you enslave people? Probably after you beat them in a war or you capture their town. Most of these old civilizations, when they capture the town, they would kidnap the women and children and enslave them or make them servants or do some whatever with them. It was always prisoners of war. It's always been like that. But I feel like people tend to focus on a certain area. Like, I'm not saying that we should forget about how bad it was, because we shouldn't. But when we just laser focus and pinpoint on one specific era in thousands of years of a slavery, you're focusing on one piece of the pizza, like one slice of pepperoni on a whole extra large pizza. You know what I mean? Like, you see where I'm getting to?
And so they bought slaves from African rulers
Africans
and
traded them,
traders.
yes.
The vast
Doing
majority
business.
of slaves taken out of Africa was sold by African rulers, traders, and military aristocracy who grew wealthy from the business.
Of course.
Most slaves were acquired through wars or by kidnapping. And before you start thinking that this is excessively barbaric, this was the standard for almost every civilized society all across the world. For example, in ancient Greece, Strabo tells us that the island of Delos trafficked in 10,000 slaves a day, even before the Roman Empire, even when we're coming to the end of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. It's estimated that a third of Italy was made up of slaves. Slaves made up of people whom the Romans had conquered and taken back to Italy to do hard labor.
That's like what I said. When you kidnap a town, you make the citizens work for you. It's been like that forever. But let me stop interjecting.
And so, to anyone even slightly educated on this subject, it is absolutely unsurprising to find that, for example, in 1510, the capital of the Empire of Songhai was teeming with slaves. Slave trading in West Africa was common, but it was different to what you expect. It wasn't for commercial purposes. It was to show status and to give the wealthy African elite a comfortable life. And with the appearance of Europeans desperate to buy slaves for use in the Americas, the character of African slave ownership changed. Indeed it did. The character of slavery on the west coast of Africa changed to look a lot more like the character of slavery on the east coast of Africa, because we're going to talk about the Arab slave trade, specifically the circumstance of Swahili-speaking peoples.
But this is the one that nobody talks about. The one that nobody talks about. Nobody talks about this slave trade at all. Like, they don't bring this up. You know what I mean? It's a division. It's a division thing. You know what I mean? It's a division thing. You know, like, the media always pushes. You notice how every day on the news, it's always something terrible that they blurt up in headlines. like the same, like the day when it was the school shooting, like the week or two ago in Tennessee. That's all you saw every episode. School shooting, school shooting. Like they want you to live in fear. They want you to cower. They want you to just be distraught all the time. To constantly be worrying about something is going to happen to me. You know what I mean? Like, it's all a lot of fear mongering and a lot of just narrative pushing and a lot of decision making to definitely keep dividing people. It's always something. They always present an issue, but then they don't expand on the issue, so it leaves room for debate. And then when people are debating, they're arguing. They're not trying to come together. They're trying to constantly prove their point. Oh, I'm right and you're wrong. Instead of, okay, how can we compromise and form a solution and get things done?
Unsurprisingly, the Arabs, being far closer to sub-Saharan Africa than the Europeans, had been taking advantage of it for far longer.
Of course.
They were a people with as much commercial nous as anyone else. The ruling class of coastal Swahili society, sultans, government officials and wealthy merchants, used non-Muslim slaves as domestic servants and to work on farms and estates. And they even had plantations, such as the Omani Sultan Said, who became immensely rich when he started up clove plantations in the 1820s with slave labour. Arab Muslims settled along the coast and intermixed with the locals, forming a people and culture known as Swahili, which started in around the 10th century AD. So unsurprisingly, the East Africa slave trade was well established long before Europeans arrived on the scene and was driven by demands for labour by the sultanates of the Middle East. You might be thinking, well, that's interesting. If the Arabs had been in Africa for about 1,000 years, taking sub-Saharan African slaves, why isn't there a very large population of black people in Arabia? And the answer to that is that the Arabs used to castrate them, cock and balls entirely, a practice that was supposed to have ended in 1962 when slavery was finally outlawed in places like Saudi Arabia. This, of course, does not mean that the trade has actually stopped. It is still going on today. It's impossible to know exactly how many slaves the Arabs took from
Holy It's a shame that in America that they want to ban apps. They worry about apps because they feel like the apps teach you too much information. Like they want to limit what you can watch on YouTube. They want to limit they want to limit these TikToks or these apps where people can learn this information that they're not getting from the actual people that are supposed to be helping them. That this is actively going on, and I just now found out about this. That is ridiculous. We don't talk about it because, it's over there. It's over there in the Middle East. We don't care. America, we don't care about the Middle America. We don't care about anybody else. Doesn't matter if it's not going on in America. It doesn't matter. All we do is bomb them people over there anyway. Like literally. We ain't learned nothing about the Arab slave trade. I've had to learn about it just from hearsay and stuff on the internet.
Saharan Africa on the east coast, but one historian produced a total of 17 million slaves. I doubt it was that high, but again, we can't know. And it was for over 1,000 years that this was happening.
Yeah,
the point is that slavery was ubiquitous. No matter where on earth you travelled, you found slaves. In Europe, in China, in the Middle East, in the New World, in India, in Scandinavia, in Africa. Slavery was as common an institution as animal husbandry. The only thing that separated the Christian nations of Western Europe from anyone else on earth was the efficiency with which they could transport taken slaves. And it should come as
30,000 voyages. Think about that. 30,000 voyages from Portugal to Africa. Wait. Where are they going? including Brazil. So they were bringing people from Africa to Brazil. Like, that might not seem like a lot, but that's 30,000 voyages back and forth. Like, that's a coordinated effort. Like, that's an actual business model. Like, how can you coordinate that many voyages? Like, that's a business. That's like a production. That's like a corporation at that point.
It's no surprise that this was made possible by advances in technology that the rest of the world simply didn't have. The most common number I could find regarding the total number of slaves taken from Africa by Europeans was 11 million, and that is in about a 400-year time span. Portugal took the most slaves, with over 4.5 million transported to the New World. Then Britain with over 2.5 million, then Spain and France totaling just under 3 million. And just so no one is under any illusions, the transatlantic slave trade must have been close to hell on earth. Slaves were taken from Africa and packed into conditions so disgraceful and disgusting, it is unsurprising that there was such a high mortality rate for the crossing. As offensive as this is to look at, we have to remember that this is a consequence of dehumanization. The slaves were not people, they were chattel. It will obviously come as absolutely no surprise that the driving motivation behind slavery was economic.
It was money, right? It's money. It's money. And again, I have to address some people from the video. It was like, oh, it wasn't free labor. You had to feed them, house them, provide clothes. Do you really think they were giving these slaves the top of the top? You really think they were putting them in actual homes? They were putting them in shacks, feeding them scraps of the food, letting them eat out of the pig troughs, tattered clothes. You think they weren't treating these people well? They didn't see them as people. It was a commodity. They were just worker bees. Like, it's I understand, like I get, like you have to still maintain the person in order to get use out of them. I understand what you're saying. Like, I understand the argument. But these people were not going out. They were not going through all these loopholes just to accommodate these people. They were putting these people in whatever they could find, giving them enough to keep them alive throughout the day. Like, literally just enough to keep them alive and just enough so they can have some clothes. But I see what the point is.
Portuguese merchants traded with Africans from trading posts they set up along the coast. They exchanged items like brass and copper bracelets for such products as pepper, cloth, beads, and slaves.
Like bartering.
All part of an existing internal African trade. But the transatlantic slave trade really took off when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. The Portuguese initially had a monopoly on the slave trade, but this was broken in the 16th century when England, followed by France and other European nations, entered the trade. Unsurprisingly, this was a massively profitable trade for everyone involved except the slaves. Africa's rulers, traders, and military aristocracy protected their interest in the slave trade. They discouraged Europeans from leaving the coastal areas to venture to the interior of the continent. European trading companies realized the benefit of dealing with African suppliers and not unnecessarily antagonizing them. The companies could not have mustered the resources it would have taken to directly capture the tens of millions of people shipped out of Africa. It was far more sensible and safer to give Africans guns to fight in the many wars that yielded captives for trade. The slave trading network stretched deep into Africa's interior. Slave trading firms were aware of their dependency on African suppliers. And these
slave trading firms, like, these are actual businesses being set up to manage the slavery of people. Think about that. This was a institutional economical practice that happened all over the world. It's ridiculous. And the thing is, these people were deliberately going to war to capture people to sell off to the Europeans. Like, what? They were profiting. Of course they were. Look at these rich people from foreign lands. They can help me. They can bring me money. All I have to do is just enslave people. Let's like. Oh my God, this is just like a. It's not that I'm like uncomfortable receiving it, but it's just like. There's so many light bulbs going off, and it's just like a wow, you know.
African suppliers were making insane amounts of money. For example, the King of Benin was making £250,000 a year selling people into slavery in 1750. And his...
What the freak? Hold on. I gotta do my conversions. So I just did a calculation. 250,000 pounds in 1750 would be $67,911,177.97. So he would have almost been making 68 million pounds a year selling people into slavery. That is insane, dude. What? King Gizo said in the 1840s he would do anything the British wanted him to do apart from giving up slave trade.
His successor said in the 1840s that he would do anything the British wanted him to do apart from giving up the slave trade. Quote, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth.
Their wealth?
The lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery. With an industry so profitable to so many people involved, and so widespread as to be common to almost every nation on earth, why would the British want King Gizo to give up the slave trade?" Well, we need to turn back the clock to 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, when a French-speaking Duke of Viking descent called William the Bastard defeated King Harold Godwinson of England. William the Bastard was refashioned as William the Conqueror and took the crown of England, and one of the first things he did as King of England was to have the entire country inventoried. This record was known as the Domesday Book, and we still have it. Thanks to this hard work, we know that around 1086, 10% of the recorded population of England was slaves. 20 years earlier, when he had first conquered England, William had enacted a series of laws, one of which prohibited the slave trade out of England. "I prohibit the sale of a man by another outside of the country on pain of a fine paid in full to me." We don't know what William's motivation for making this law was, but given that the punishment for breaking it was a fine, I doubt it was for humanitarian reasons.
Right.
Whatever his reasons, within a generation of 1086, slavery had almost died out in England, presumably because William the Conqueror had outlawed the trade of slaves. There appears to also have been a trend for lords to endow their slaves to perform their ploughing functions as free ploughmen. While not a wonderful state of affairs, serfdom is better than chattel slavery. And this state of affairs was solidified...
We're going to slightly upgrade you from slaves to free ploughmen. Yeah, it's a slight upgrade. You know, we get promoted a little bit.
by the Church at the Synod of Westminster in 1102, where the Church denounced simony, clerical marriages, and slavery. This made England a very unique case. There probably wasn't another country in the world at this time that had outlawed slavery. There were practically no motivations.
It was such a practice in the world. It was
incredibly lucrative, endemic to the point of normalcy, so it wasn't even viewed as immoral. And the chances are William the Conqueror himself made the slave trade in England illegal just so he could make a quick buck. Fast forward 700 years, and the international transatlantic slave trade is in full swing. And yet we still do not have slaves in England. And this is where we meet a man named Granville Sharp, a very well-educated, rationalist thinker of the Enlightenment, who became an active campaigner for the abolition of the slave trade.
Okay.
Granville had had previous legal success defending Jonathan Strong from his erstwhile slave master after being brought to England from the colonies, but we're going to look at the subsequent Somerset case. James Somerset was a slave from Virginia in America who had come to England with his master Charles Stuart in 1769 and had run away in October 1771. After evading slave hunters employed by Stuart for 56 days, Somerset had been caught, put onto the slave ship Anne and Mary to be taken to Jamaica and sold. 3 Londoners had applied to Lord Mansfield for a writ of habeas corpus, which had been granted, with Somerset having to appear at a hearing on the 24th of January in 1772. Members of the public responded to the plight by sending money to pay for his lawyers, who in any event gave their services pro bono publico, while Stuart's costs were met by the West Indian planters and merchants. Given his prior legal experience with the Jonathan Strong case, Sharp briefed Somerset's lawyers. The judgment was delivered on the 22nd of June 1772, and it was a clear victory for Somerset, Sharp, and the lawyers who had acted for Somerset.
Look at that.
Mansfield acknowledged that English law did not allow slavery, and only a new Act of Parliament could bring it into legality. The verdict established one thing very clearly: a slave becomes free the moment he sets foot on English soil. And this was, according to Lord Mansfield, that the air of England is too pure for any slave to breathe. No matter what reason William the Conqueror outlawed slavery for, by the time this judgment was drawn by Lord Mansfield, it had become a point of principle. This precedent wasn't set for Mansfield's personal interests. This precedent was set to determine right from wrong.
Yes.
Granville Sharp went on to co-found the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade with fellow like-minded Enlightenment thinkers. And after 20 long years of campaigning in Parliament, which I won't detail here, they were successful in their goal of abolishing the international slave trade in 1807. Now, if you know anything about 1807, you'll know that this was during the War of the Fourth Coalition, where Napoleon Bonaparte was savaging great powers all across the European continent. The Napoleonic Wars led to new territorial acquisitions for Britain and helped stuff Parliament with more abolitionists than they had before, which is why the bill providing for the abolition of the slave trade to conquered territories triumphantly passed in both houses. And the following year this was superseded by a stronger measure that outlawed the British Atlantic slave trade altogether. But, given the raging war in Europe, it was rather difficult to enforce due to a paucity of available resources.
Yeah, in fact, because if you're fighting Napoleon, this crazy guy from France who's trying to take over Europe, yeah, I mean, you got 6 countries banding together trying to fight this guy.
After 1807, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, having achieved its goals, became the African Institution, whose principal aim was to ensure the new legislation was enforced and that other countries followed Britain's example. Persuading other countries to join Britain outlawing the slave trade proved more difficult. Despite the efforts of the African Institution and those of British ministers, the Congresses of Paris and Vienna in 1814 and 1815 both failed to reach a specific agreement. Given that this was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it's hardly surprising that there was French opposition. Where diplomacy had failed, the Royal Navy had to succeed. It's one thing declaring a writ that people...
Oh no, I think that's crazy that he actually, and that you gotta think about during like that time where William the Conqueror was around, like this was when society was super just simple, modern. I'm sure it was probably like a caste system back then, where if you were born into poor, if you were born poor, you're gonna die poor. Like you can't ascend at all. Like you had to, if you were nobility, you were just miles ahead of everyone else, and your life was 10 times better than everyone below you. And you know, in the face of that, he actually outlawed it for some reason. We'll never know why he did it, but
may no longer profit from the trading of human beings. It's another thing to enforce that. Enter the West African Squadron. The West African Squadron was a detachment of the Royal Navy that was given the task of blockading Africa, the continent, to make sure that slave traders were not taking slaves to the Americas. Needless to say, in 1807, there was only a token force performing this operation, comprising of 2 ships. This number was increased to 5 ships until the War of 1812 with the United States, but after 1815, with Britain victorious in Europe and supreme at sea, the Royal Navy turned its attention back to the challenge. The institution of slavery was formally abolished in the British Empire in 1833, and by the 1850s, around 25 vessels and 2,000 officers and men were on the station, supported by nearly 1,000 crewmen. Experienced fishermen recruited as sailors from what is now the coast of modern Liberia. It's worth noting that this was not a pleasant job.
Oh no, it was,
the mortality rate was 5 times higher compared with fleets in the Mediterranean or in home waters.
Like, just think about how crazy that is. Slavery was so dominant in people's societies that they had to establish a force to stop people from taking slaves from Africa. They had to stop people from taking slaves. They had to blockade against America, against a lot of other countries. They had to stop people from getting them, like setting up troops, defending with guns, and also against other men with guns looking to do deals and take people hostage.
To help incentivize the crew, money was actually given to each crew per slave that they freed. But there was a real zeitgeist in Britain for the abolition of slavery. For example, the pursuit and capture of slave ships became celebrated naval engagements, widely reported back in peacetime Britain. They became a source of national pride. So it's no wonder that many of the crews really did have an evangelical zeal about the anti-slavery patrolling. However, I don't want to give the impression that this was all for humanitarian reasons.
I know that.
There's no doubt that Britain, in her foreign policy, used her anti-slavery laws as a stick with which to beat her opponents, primarily the Spaniards and the Portuguese, who refused to conform to these demands. Britain demanded Spain, Portugal, and the very new nation of Brazil to declare slave trading to be piracy. And while these nations paid lip service to these principles, they failed to enforce them, which led to a British blockade of Brazil by 1850, which of course forced the nascent Brazilian Empire to capitulate. And it didn't...
That's crazy how, like... That's crazy how, in order to force a country to submit to you, yes, we will block your country and starve your people, and no one will be able to get supplies in. That is insane. That is an insane level of just, like, torture and just, like, you're getting no food, no water, no medical supplies until you do what we say.
Didn't end there. In the 1860s, David Livingstone reports of Arab atrocities against enslaved Africans stirred up the interest of the British public, reviving the flagging abolitionist movement. Throughout the 1870s, the Navy attempted to suppress this abominable eastern trade at Zanzibar in particular. Needless to say, the British Navy continued their mission against the slavers across the Indian Ocean. The abolition of slavery became the British project. It captured the hearts and minds of the entire country, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant. This is certainly how the British saw it. For example, this spirit of chivalry, we see it in acts of heroism by land and sea in fights against the slave trade. Alfred Tennyson, the unweary, unostentatious, and inglorious crusade of England against slavery may probably be regarded as among the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous pages comprised in the History of Nations. William Lecky. All of this was done against the vested financial interests of hundreds of thousands of people. Entire nations were against the idea of abolishing slavery and the slave trade. The very notion was alien to the human existence until Britain made it happen. In the 19th century, if you saw a ship bearing down on you, flying this flag, and you were a slave trader, you knew that this flag stood for liberty. This was the flag of a nation that defied human convention for a point of principle and spent its blood, sweat, tears and treasure to enforce it on the world. This is the flag of the nation that accepted the absolute moral truth that slavery is wrong.
Right.
No matter what riches can be amassed, no matter what power can be gained, no matter the cost, slavery had to be abolished. That was the British Crusade. When Britain held the reins of world power, that is what she did with it. So Frankie, to be honest with you, when you say, we have streets named after slave owners, we have profited from a vile crime and feel no shame, it is British people that don't learn languages or British history. Britain is the true scrounger, the true criminal. I have to concur. British people apparently do not learn British history because Britain's involvement in the slave trade is one of the most proud moments any nation could have had in their history. I want to make one thing crystal clear, Frankie. You live in a world without slavery because of Britain.
Well, it's definitely a lot to think about. You know what I mean? And the fact that, like, this wasn't just, they weren't doing it. They were doing it, like, this was all economic. Like, the fact that it was so bad, they had to literally blockade Africa. And they had to employ the Navy to stop people from going to Africa and taking slaves. And then I kind of already had a conniption that it was some type of business deal that had to be worked out between the tribal leaders. And it's probably, oh, look, we have this amount of slaves that we got from this war that we just fought. We beat this nation and we were able to capture 1,000 people that we can sell into slavery. What's your price? They had to, like, there's no way that some random guy is going to sell thousands and thousands of miles at the attempt to get slaves. It had to be some type of deal worked out. It had to be. Because you see how much they profited. Like King Zeno, he made, to this day, he would have made $68 million a year of selling slaves. He said he would do anything the British wanted him to do, but stop selling slaves. Think about it. It was all economic. Slavery is an economic practice. It is an economic practice that is morally wrong. We need to focus more on this Arab slave trade that's still going on today. It's still going on to this day in other countries. But we're, like, of course, I don't want to tell people to forget about how bad slavery in America was. But we can't just keep harping on that when we got stuff that's going on right now, man. We got stuff that's going on right to this, in this right moment. Probably now, somebody is enslaved somewhere in the world somewhere. Somebody's enslaved. They can't get out. You know what I mean? Somewhere, somebody is. Can we bring more light to this so we can make it a campaign to stop that as well? You feel me? But anyways, thank you again. That's all I had to say. I really appreciate the support from these videos. Definitely leave a like if you enjoyed. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to my channel. Turn on my post notifications so that you don't miss the videos, because sometimes YouTube doesn't send out the notifications. I don't know why. Sometimes the notifications just don't go out. Check out my Discord down in the description. Check out my Patreon. I got videos on there that are, you can watch those for free. Check out my gaming channel. But anyways, I'm out. Peace.